Curious to find out which Canadian fashion magazine is the most diverse? Today we find out. Welcome everyone to our third and final video in our first ever annual wrap-up of our monthly column, Covers and Content. This video is a culmination of a project that the Closet Feminist does all year. The purpose of this project is to take a look at each issue published by the three major Canadian fashion magazines, Elle Canada, Fashion, and Flair, to determine how diverse the content is. We've based our summaries on three questions. First, does the cover feature a person of color? Second, do any of the major editorials feature a model of color? And lastly, do any of the major editorials feature a model who may be considered plus size? As I mentioned in the first video of this series, when I say person or model of color, I refer to someone who doesn't necessarily have white privilege at first glance. And when I say plus size model, I refer to a model who doesn't necessarily have thin privilege at first glance. For this last video, we'll be looking at the diversity in Flair magazine. I'll end the video by comparing it to Elle Canada and Fashion, and we'll see which Canadian fashion magazine has had the best representation of minorities. Flair printed 12 issues this year, all of which had editorials. Flair had a positive start to the year with a woman of color on their January cover, Leah Michelle from Glee. The rest of the issue is fairly status quo, one horoscope-inspired editorial starring one thin white model. February had Paulina Gretzky on the cover, which I personally found to be an interesting choice. Canadian media has a fascination with her for obvious reasons, which is interesting since she's American and a staunch Republican at that. In terms of fame, she seems to be famous just for her familial connection. Given this, I wish that Flair had gone with a more relevant or diverse celebrity like Ellen Wong, the Canadian star of the Carrie Diaries, who they did a small interview with at the back of this issue. Overall, the February issue was a whiteout issue, which I defined in the last video. It had just one editorial featuring a thin, white model. Flair's March issue was definitely the low point of the year for me personally. It was a whiteout issue featuring Charlotte Free on the cover shortly after she made some highly offensive comments about violence against women. The rest of the issue I found to be quite racist and problematic as it relied heavily on cultural appropriation and Orientalism, evidently attempting to draw upon Japanese culture as an overall theme of sorts for this issue. When this issue of Flair hit newsstands in March, the Closet Feminist did an article critiquing the issue as a whole because, sorry Flair, but Japanese culture is just that. It is a culture, not a commodity to be bastardized in the form of fashion haikus and vaguely Asian-inspired clothing details. However, Flair is not the only Canadian fashion magazine to feature some seriously problematic content. Indeed, as I pointed out in the last video, Fashion committed a similar faux pas with the yellow face spread which they printed in their April issue. Beyond this, there were three editorials including Free's cover story, though none of them had models of color or plus-size models. Moving on, the April issue of Flair had Diane Kruger on the cover and featured two editorials which were actually relatively diverse. The first editorial starred a model of color exclusively for the first time in Flair's 2013 publishing year. The second editorial was a token diversity spread. It starred three models, but only one of them was a model of color. None of the editorials this month featured a plus-size model. May starred Christina Hendricks on the cover, the first and only magazine out of the three magazines we discuss in this project to feature a cover star who might be considered plus size. Other than that, May is a whiteout issue. The first editorial stars model Kirsten Owen and her daughter Billy Rose. The second editorial stars one thin white model. The June issue of Flair was also a whiteout issue featuring actress Greta Gerwig on the cover. There were two editorials, both typical and status quo, as they both starred thin white models. July featured Flair's second cover star of color, Olivia Munn. This issue was actually particularly diverse and noteworthy overall. We even wrote an article about it, praising what we consider to be especially progressive. There was so much good stuff in this issue, yet it's too bad that this influenced and spread to the editorial, which featured one thin white model. In August, for the second month in a row, Flair chose a woman of color for their cover, supermodel Arlenis Souza. Souza starred in the only editorial for the August issue, which was Flair's smallest issue of the year overall. September was a big month for Flair. They debuted their new layout, catching the eye of major fashion news sources everywhere, though not necessarily for good reasons. Amber Heard was on the cover, and the cover was mocked wildly for featuring such a boring picture of her. September's editorials are pretty good, one starring a model of color exclusively, which was exciting, the other starring one thin white model. October saw Kerry Washington on the cover, another woman of color, which was definitely encouraging. This issue had two editorials. The first one was fairly status quo with one thin white model. The other editorial was a token diversity spread starring 6 Toronto-based musicians. Of these 6, just 2 were women of color, and only one of these women could be considered plus size. November also starred a woman of color on the cover. Alexa Chung. Like Elle Canada, November's issue of Flare was particularly noteworthy, and again, we wrote a whole article dedicated to its awesomeness. The editorials were less diverse. Of the three printed, only Chung's cover story could be considered as an editorial featuring a woman of color. None of them had a plus-size model, however. Flare closed out the year with a whiteout issue, which is really too bad since we love cover star Kristen Bell and the general girl power feel of the issue as a whole. There were two editorials in the December issue, one starring comedian Lizzie Kaplan, who is a closet feminist favorite. The second editorial was woefully status quo, featuring two thin white models. Okay, so let's recap. Flare put out 12 issues this year, 5 featured cover stars of color. They had a total of 22 editorials, 6 of which featured models of color. Since 2 of these were token diversity spreads, however, there were only 4 editorials from Flare this year that starred a model of color exclusively. There is just one issue of Flare that featured one plus-size model for one page, the same as Elle Canada this past year. Overall, I will say that personally, Flare is my favorite Canadian fashion magazine right now. Their makeover that took place in September was a smart move, and even before that, it was clear to me that Flare is a feminist fashion magazine. Looking back on all the issues of all 3 magazines, I would say Elle Canada is also quite feminist. They both had double the amount of cover stars of color than Fashion, and clearly make efforts in their reporting to recognize the work of women of all backgrounds. There is always room for improvement, though, and until I see the erasure of whiteout issues and token diversity spreads entirely from all 3 magazines, I can't say that I'll be completely at ease with the work that they are doing. So that wraps up the first annual summary of our monthly covers and content column. Diversity in Canadian fashion magazines is really important, and the Closet Feminist will continue to monitor the progress of Elle Canada, Fashion, and Flare in the coming year. Join us every month for a new summary on theclosetfeminist.ca.